there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. Today we bring you the first of our 3 interview episodes conducted as part of the Global Educators Local Connections Forum at the JALT 2017 conference in November. Today's episode contains an interview with Professor Steve Mann. Steve works in the Centre of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick. Steve's research interests include teacher training schemes, teacher education and development in different national situations, as well as reflective practice. His published work includes the 2016 book, The Research Interview, and 2017's Reflective Practice in English Language Teaching, Research-Based Principles and Practices, written with Steve Walsh. During the interview, I asked Steve questions about reflective practice, a topic of which he gave a workshop on earlier in the conference, as well as interviewing as a method of inquiry. Thank you for joining us, Steve. I know it's very late in the conference on a Sunday, and you must be very tired.
No, thank you very much for the welcome. It's been a great conference so far, and thanks for inviting me to answer some questions.
Thank you. So I just gave you an introduction earlier on, but what I'd like to ask you first of all is, could you tell us about your teaching and research background, both on the global stage and more locally in the UK?
Okay, well, I started life as a drama teacher in the UK, and I did that for about 4 years and thought I would like to go and do something different. So I thought, well, I'll be a TEFL teacher. And I applied for a job in Hong Kong after getting a diploma qualification, and I taught there for a couple of years in a scheme. So I was employed as a native teacher, and then I went to Japan, and I spent 5 years working for the British Council, and then I worked for American Express, setting up an ESP unit for them, and did a master's, and they asked me to stay as a lecturer, so I started working at Aston University. I was lucky enough to work with a really great team of people, Julian Edge, Keith Richards, Jane Willis, people like that, and it was a very democratic department, so I was very lucky to find myself in that space. Julian and Keith were very interested in teacher development, so that's what I ended up doing my PhD about, and I've been working at Aston, Birmingham and now Warwick, looking at teacher development, interaction, and increasingly looking at research processes.
Okay. And a lot of those themes will come up in today's interview. In particular, we're going to be talking about teacher development, but we're going to be focusing on reflective practice first. And yesterday I attended Steve's workshop about reflective practice tools. I thought perhaps for our listeners first and the people here, very broadly, what is reflective practice?
I would define it as the kind of everyday activity, thinking activity, thought, that a teacher does as part of their work. Some of it might be retrospective, some of it might be in the moment, and some of it might be kind of forward-looking to further action. And you might contrast it with research, which is a lot more demanding and time-consuming. Reflection is probably something that most good teachers do. Sometimes it's not done in particularly systematic ways, it's maybe not carried on over a period of time, and there are some issues, I think, in the way that reflection is put forward in publications and in teacher education and in training. So, you know, in terms of what I think it is, it's quite simple. The question is how can it be best supported? and what kind of activities can teachers do in the limited amount of time that they have, which are going to help them keep engaged and interested and forward-looking in their work.
So reflection is an integral part of being a competent teacher. You mentioned that RP has become quite tired and in need of revitalisation, or maybe people don't quite understand what it really is. I wonder if you could tell us what needs particular attention at this time, and how do we give it that attention?
Yeah, I think reflective practice has been around for a long time, so it's got a kind of orthodox status and has become perhaps a little bit unexamined, that it's something that we say, yes, you should be reflective, and there might be some readings about Schoen and Dewey, and teachers are expected to really work out how to be reflective on their own. So it's tired only to the extent that it's become so much part of the landscape that perhaps people have not given it the attention that it deserves. But I think for me some of the main problems are that it's presented often as an individual kind of inside the head activity, often associated with writing, again as an individual activity. And I think that way of looking at reflective practice undervalues the collaborative, interactive, what I would call the dialogic kind of reflection, which is between people, but also aided by tools and activities which shape the kinds of reflection that people are able to do. So if it's only portrayed as an individual writing activity, that's quite limiting. It's not to say that writing in a reflective way is a waste of time. I don't believe that at all. It's a very valuable thing to do. But it perhaps represents reflection as too much of an individual writing. So I think my work with Steve Walsh over the last few years, Steve's a professor at Newcastle University, we've tried to find a way of working with reflective practice which opens up some of the tools and ideas, but critically for me, perhaps the most important thing is that a lot of writing about reflective practice doesn't have any teachers involved in it, or their voices, or any interaction or data from teachers. So we have kind of set out to revitalise it, if you like, by involving teachers and teacher educators in sharing their practice and some of the data from their practice, so that we get a more concrete sense of what it means.
And obviously by collecting this kind of data, you're hoping to establish more kind of coherent frameworks. Would that be correct?
No, I don't think we're in the job of offering another framework. I think in some ways the landscape is a bit too dominated by new frameworks. We were more interested in the data of people doing reflection and opening out that process. So again, I've got nothing against frameworks, but like action research, the main thing is understanding what projects can do and how to go about them, rather than having a model of cycles and steps or whatever. I don't think that those are necessarily always helpful for teachers, especially if they've got to choose between 8 different models of reflective practice.
You mentioned tools earlier, writing being one tool, for example. In your workshop yesterday, you also talked about spoken forms of reflection. So I wonder if you could tell us more about the tools of spoken reflection.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few, but I will give you a couple of examples. My work with Julian Edge, going back to the 90s, works with something that he called cooperative development, which is a way of talking with a peer, another teacher trainer, which is a different way of talking, where you try and avoid evaluation, suggestion, and try and concentrate and create a kind of zone of proximal development, if you like, where the talk scaffolds an idea. So that is one way of talking, which I think is a kind of reflective talk, cooperative development. But if you take, for example, post-observation conferences where somebody is learning to be a teacher. They do a trial lesson, either a micro-teaching or a teaching practice, and they'll sit down with the supervisor. Now that is a very important kind of interaction, obviously, because that is what determines their teacher development and their sense of learning. And I think that post-observation conference, or we could call it a POC, there are choices in the kinds of talk that you might develop as a supervisor or a mentor. And they can be more or less reflective, more or less dialogic. You can spend that time to tell the teacher what they should have done, or you can create an opportunity for them to learn, maybe as self-observation or peer observation. So we suggest in the book, drawing together lots of other useful contributions from teacher trainers, ways in making that talk reflective. Or we might use video and perhaps video record a lesson and then use a software like VO or Iris Connect to tag that video and make that the object of the reflection. So we're very interested in collaborative peer correction, but also in more hierarchical relationships like supervisor-trainee, and the kinds of tools and activities like stimulated recall or particular softwares that help in making that talk more evidence-based and more reflective.
I see. Just from my personal experience, I've been in these post-observation sessions where we're giving advice to each other, or somebody's giving advice to me, but I haven't asked for the advice. I'm just being given advice. Do you think that I'd consider myself being a more reflectively aware teacher than some of my peers, for example? Do you think it is a difficult skill to just be an understander or an active listener?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, and it is for me. It is for lots of people. Our natural inclination is to give advice and to give suggestions and tell stories about our own lives. And natural talk, if you like, is different from professional talk. And I think that we can sometimes step back and be reflective about the kind of talk that we're engaging in. So I think you're right. I think it's sometimes difficult to be a good empathetic understander. And it's also the case that some students don't want that either. You have to be sensitive to some students want the advice. They don't want to mess around having kind of reflective conversations. Yeah. So it's not always, it's horses for courses. Some people are able or want to have a more dialogic, reflective discussion. Some people just want to know, what they did wrong, and so it's sometimes a case of trying to gear the talk to the possibilities and the people that you're working with. But most of the time, I think it's worth the effort to try and understand a little more and talk a little less.
Yeah. So that kind of ties to my next question. So this time around, the conference has a global theme to it, and we've heard the word global being used a number of times this weekend. And in a similar way, reflection and reflective practice is also, like we talked about, very social, communal, and dialogic in nature. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the socio-cultural background to reflective practice. For example, you said that some students might not feel comfortable with this kind of interaction.
Yeah, that's quite a big question, but I think I'd start off by saying that we live in a world where a lot of education is giving answers to questions that people aren't particularly interested in, and giving lots of information which may or not be information that somebody wants at a particular time, and that often education is much better if people are asking questions, and then you as a teacher or a teacher educator are involved in facilitating a process where they might solve those questions themselves, but also sometimes you need to feed information and views and concepts and frameworks into that process. But generally speaking, a constructivist or socio-cultural view of learning wants to make spaces where people are able to make progress in their own development and their own understanding. So a socio-cultural theory will set up a series of tasks or activities to provide both stimulus and input, but also space to work with those ideas and to own those ideas by articulating and developing your position related to those areas. So those for me are the key aspects of a constructivist or socio-cultural view of learning, and that's why I think things like video and tools can be very powerful in bringing that evidence, those critical incidents, those vignettes into the learning process, rather than seeing the whole process as a case of received knowledge which needs to be transferred and transmitted to people.
Yeah. Okay. And reflection for some could be an attempt to kind of better make sense of our context around us. But in your book, you talk about how we may adopt a static view of context, and I'm wondering if you could kind of unpack, or how we can understand context better before we reflect upon it, for example.
Yeah, I don't really remember saying anything about static context. I may have done, and my memory's not too good, but I think going back to the global and the local, that really you can see global, as big ideas that float around, whether they're from Stephen Krashen or Vygotsky or whatever, and these are the kind of global big concepts that we receive through education or teacher training, and we have to map those onto local context. Local context are where you teach, the learners that you work with, the materials that you have to work with. So for me, it's always been important to try to connect these bigger global concepts, movements to particular contexts. Ideas of Prabhu, for example, a long time ago now, 1990, is there's no best method. There won't be one method that is globally transferable to all contexts. That really all we have is developing this sense of plausibility through reflective practice and taking advantage of the information and technologies that we have to create an appropriate methodology, learning context for our students. And to do that, in Van Leer's terms, we need to be really sensitive to the small detail of these ecologies, to interaction, to the feedback that we get from learners. So for me, that's the kind of connection, if you like, between the global and the local, and that the more teachers around the world that can connect, or teacher educators, and share the particulars of their local practice, that is a much better way to go for me, a much more bottom-up connection, community of practice, than looking for the next Stephen Krashen or Michael Long to solve our problems by coming up with a new theory or framework which is going to roll from theory into practice. For me, that's the wrong way round, and always will be. I'm much more interested in teachers connecting and sharing examples of local practice.
I see. Okay. Changing focus slightly and taking a very meta view of things for a minute. Our podcasting project is a form of CPD for us, continuing professional development, as producers and teachers, and as for our listeners too. It's also a form of continuing professional development, listening to our podcast. With interviews such as this, offering a form of dialogical content in terms of content for listening at presentations. You've also written a book about qualitative research interviews, and I wonder how interview interactions are reflective acts, and more broadly, what's the relationship between interview setups and professional development?
Wow, that's a big question. I think I could talk about that for an hour, so I'll try and give you a snapshot of a couple of ideas. First of all, I am very passionate about interviews. I always enjoyed watching them, whether it's a news interview or a political interview or a sports interview. And even today, you asking me the questions and me talking about them live in this way, I'm saying things that I possibly haven't said before. You make realizations, you say things in a different way. You say to me something about static I can't even remember
Context.
static context, and I think, did I say that? And it makes me reformulate, what would I have meant by static context?
I may have misread it.
No, you may have done, but it's still helpful. It's still helpful in moving on ideas to get a space where we can try and get further with our thinking. What do we really believe? Do I think that's more important than that? You say that, that's interesting. Let me think about it for a second. You know, to me, that's why I got interested in interviews in the first place. I was never interested in questionnaires and big data. I was much more interested in these kind of local understandings. How does this teacher work with these learners? In order to understand that, I really need to maybe watch them teach and then do some stimulated recall and say, you did this at this moment, why did you do that? And that's what gets into the detail, into this kind of ecological view of the class. So for me, being reflexive about interviews, I thought that a lot of my PhD students were kind of treating them as a kind of extraction exercise, like a dentist just sort of taking, teeth out. They weren't really thinking about how the context and the questions that they asked and how they recruited the person to the interview, what effect that actually had on the interaction. Right. And so that's, I think, why I became interested in the interaction of interviews, their power, their interest, but also in being more reflexive myself and maybe encouraging my students to be more reflexive about the interview.
I see, okay. And we'll leave it there, okay? But it's been great speaking to you today. So okay. A round of applause for Steve Mann.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening today. We'd also like to say a big thank you to Professor Steve Mann for taking part in our forum and for agreeing to be interviewed by us. Our next interview recorded as part of our forum will be coming shortly. In the meantime, you can contact us by emailing at TEFLology@gmail.com, following us on Twitter at TEFLology, liking our page on Facebook, and by listening to our previous episodes, TEFLology-podcast.com. Please also feel free to rate and review us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or Acast. If you'd like to show your support for our podcast, please consider buying our ebook, Podcasting and Professional Development, a guide for English language teachers, available on Amazon and Smashwords. The book is priced competitively at just over $4, and all money made from sales will go directly back into making more podcasts for you, the listener. Okay, so thanks again, and we'll be back again soon.